welcome to the channel Chronicles of Shadows. Today's story takes us to 1861, to a name spoken like a warning, Hagar Ashford. They called her a giant woman, too tall, too strong. But that was not what terrified them. What terrified them was that she thought. In December of 1861, Hagar stood in a freezing Virginia wind on an auction block for the 12th time. Near 6'4", shoulders broad, hands scarred and powerful, hands that looked made for breaking iron. Yet the buyers hesitated for one reason. She did not look away. Her eyes held something an enslaved person was never supposed to possess. Calculation, the patience of someone who already knew how the story ends. The auctioneer, Elias Weatherby, had sold people for 22 years. Nothing ever bothered him. But 3 days earlier, the trader who delivered Hagar leaned in and whispered 4 words. She ruins what owns her. Elias laughed, until those 3 days brought a snapped horse, a vanished ledger, and a white buyer who collapsed in the street like he had seen death standing behind him. Coincidence, Elias told himself. But staring into Hagar's eyes now, he could not keep that word steady. Because Hagar was not being sold 12 times to break her. She was being sold 12 times because she was building something, master by master, county by county, using the slave trade like a road. And when the gavel fell that morning, her plan was finally ready to close. Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell me in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your voice keeps these lives remembered, not erased. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, the spring of 1820. Hagar Ashford was born in the spring of 1820 on a tobacco plantation called Sweetwater, 15 miles outside Richmond, Virginia, where the soil was red with clay and blood, and the air always smelled faintly of smoke. Her mother's name was Ruth. No one recorded who her father was. No ledger bothered with that. But the lighter shade of Hagar's skin answered the question in the way plantations always did, silently, with shame pushed onto the enslaved and comfort preserved for the powerful. Ruth worked in the main house as a seamstress. Her hands were delicate despite years of labor, fingers quick with needle and thread. She mended dresses for white women who never looked her in the eye. She stitched coats for men who discussed prices over her bowed head, speaking of enslaved bodies the way merchants spoke of hogs. But Ruth had survived something most did not. She had been born on the coast of West Africa, taken at 12, shipped across the Atlantic in darkness so complete it erased time. She had survived the Middle Passage, survived Charleston, survived decades of bondage. And through all of it, she had protected one thing with a ferocity that bordered on defiance. Her mind. Ruth could read. Not just signs or simple words, but full text. English, some French. Enough to understand meaning, intent, consequence. She had learned slowly, dangerously, stealing moments the way others stole breath. A discarded newspaper. A letter dropped near the fire. Pages torn from books and used to light stoves in the kitchen. She collected words the way other enslaved people collected hope. Quietly, carefully, knowing discovery meant destruction. Ruth understood something the masters never admitted aloud. Slavery did not survive on whips alone. It survived on ignorance. An enslaved person who could read could plan, could forge passes, could understand contracts, could see the shape of the cage. That was why literacy was forbidden. That was why Ruth taught her daughter anyway. She began when Hagar was 4 years old. At night, after the quarters fell quiet, Ruth would kneel on the dirt floor with a small stick, scratching shapes into the earth by candlelight so dim it barely lived. She traced letters slowly, whispering their sounds. "This is an A, say it." "A," Hagar repeated, her voice small but steady. Again, and again, until shapes became sounds. Sounds became words. Words became weapons. By 7, Hagar could read better than most white children in the county. By 10, she devoured every scrap of text she could find. And by 12, she discovered the library. Sweetwater's master was Charles Ashford, a wealthy tobacco planter with more than 200 enslaved people and a private library that he considered his pride. Over 3,000 volumes, philosophy, law, history, science. He believed books proved refinement. He never imagined they would arm his slave. Hagar was assigned to clean the library because she was tall enough to reach the shelves and strong enough to move the furniture. No one noticed how carefully she memorized placement. No one noticed how her eyes lingered. She developed a system. Each morning, she selected one book, memorized its exact position, and hid it beneath her clothing. During the day, she stole minutes to read, behind smokehouses, beneath stairwells, in the shadowed corners of barns. At night, she read by moonlight or dying embers. Before dawn, the book returned to its place, untouched in appearance, consumed in spirit. She read law and learned how property was defined. She read history and studied revolts, why some failed and why others nearly succeeded. She read philosophy and discovered men had written entire books about freedom while denying it with clean hands. And she remembered everything. Hagar's memory was flawless. A page once seen never faded. Conversations replayed years later word for word. Faces, routes, names, filed and preserved. That gift would save her life. But first it would cost her everything. On a humid morning in 1832, Charles Ashford entered his library and stopped cold. Hagar stood by the window, sunlight on her face, holding a leather-bound book open in both hands. Cicero, Latin. For a moment, neither moved. "Where did you learn that?" Ashford asked. His voice was quiet. That was worse. Hagar said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Ashford was not considered cruel by the standards of his time. He did not whip casually. He believed slavery was benevolent. But what stood before him now terrified him in a way he could not name. This was not ignorance that had slipped. This was intelligence. Who taught you? Silence. That night, Ruth was dragged from her bed. Every enslaved person on Sweetwater was forced to watch as she was tied to the post. 39 lashes. Metal-tipped cowhide. Flesh torn open. By the 15th strike, Ruth stopped screaming. By the 30th, she collapsed. At dawn, still bleeding, she was loaded onto a wagon. Hagar begged to speak to her. Denied. Begged to be sold with her. Denied. Begged to know where she was being taken. Denied. The wagon rolled away down a dust road that never truly ended. Hagar never saw her mother again. She was 12 years old when something inside her died. And something else, cold, patient, unbreakable, took its place. Standing in the dirt where the wagon had passed, Hagar made a vow no one heard. She would make them pay. Not quickly. Not loudly. But completely. And what Charles Ashford did not know, what none of them knew, was that in trying to destroy one mind, they had created a war that would move quietly, for years, through their own system. And Sweetwater was only the beginning. After Ruth was taken, Sweetwater did not change. That was the cruelest part. The fields still woke before dawn. Tobacco leaves still bled their sticky sap into waiting hands. Overseers still counted bodies, not names. Meals were still thin. Nights were still crowded with coughs, prayers, and the sound of people crying quietly so children could sleep. Only Hagar had changed. To the others, she appeared broken in the way a 12-year-old should have been. She spoke less. She kept her head down. She worked without complaint. When the overseer barked orders, she answered quickly and moved faster than anyone else in the field. Strong. Obedient. Empty. Inside, nothing was empty. Inside, she replayed every moment of that morning, every word spoken, every decision made. She replayed the way Charles Ashford had looked at her, not with anger, but fear. That detail mattered. Fear meant weakness. Fear meant leverage. Hagar learned something important in those first months. Pain made people careless. Sweetwater's discipline tightened after Ruth's punishment. The overseers believed terror would restore order. Instead, they grew sloppy. They drank more. They trusted routine. They assumed obedience meant submission. Hagar watched it all. She studied the plantation the way a general studies terrain. She learned when wagons left and returned, which fields were harvested first, how long it took to move tobacco to the curing barns. She learned which enslaved men handled accounts, which white clerks could not read their own ledgers without help. She learned names. Franklin Wells, the bookkeeper whose eyes were failing, who relied on others to read numbers aloud. Jeremiah Tate, the overseer who vanished into town every Saturday night and did not return until Sunday afternoon. And Charles Ashford himself, methodical, predictable, arrogant. Most importantly, she learned how long people watched before they stopped looking. Weeks passed. Then months. The memory of Ruth's punishment became a warning told in whispers, then faded into routine. Charles Ashford convinced himself the lesson had been learned. The library remained unlocked. That mistake mattered. Hagar did not rush back to books. She waited. She let time do its work. By the time she returned to reading, it was only scraps. One page torn from a discarded volume, a paragraph memorized and destroyed. She never touched the same subject twice in 1 week. She never read where she could be seen. She practiced something far more dangerous than literacy. She practiced patience. At 14, she learned how ledgers worked. Not by reading them directly, but by listening. She volunteered to assist Franklin Wells, lifting boxes, holding papers steady while he squinted and muttered numbers aloud. Sometimes when he misread a figure, she corrected him gently. "No, sir. That says 7, not 1. He frowned, then nodded, trusting her voice more than his eyes. From that moment on, he asked her to read more often. Hagar learned how tobacco profits were calculated, how debts were carried, how loans were structured. She learned which plantations were leveraged and which were solvent. She learned that Sweetwater's prosperity was not as solid as Charles Ashford pretended. Debt hid beneath polish. At 16, she learned to open locks. She had read once, years earlier, about tumblers and pressure points in a book on mechanical principles. Using bits of wire and broken needles, she practiced at night on cabin doors and storage chests. Failure taught her more than success. By 17, no lock on Sweetwater could stop her. But she did not steal. Not yet. Hagar understood something most people never did. Information mattered more than action. Action too early destroyed opportunity. She needed a reason to be sold. Not punished. Not killed. Sold. Movement meant knowledge. Knowledge meant reach. She began testing boundaries carefully. A broken tool here. A spilled bucket there. Never enough to draw suspicion alone. Always just enough to be noticed by the right people. She whispered in Latin once, softly, when she knew an overseer stood nearby. She corrected arithmetic again, this time publicly. She let her eyes linger too long on a ledger. Rumors followed her like smoke. She knows things. She watches. Something wrong with that one. Charles Ashford noticed. He did not confront her directly. Instead, he began listening, to overseers, to house slaves, to the way conversation stopped when Hagar passed. He remembered the book. He remembered Ruth. And fear returned. In 1837, Ashford made a decision. He told himself it was practical. That Hagar was too disruptive, too strange, too strong-minded. Better to sell her now while she was young and valuable. Better to remove the problem. Hagar learned of the decision before it was spoken aloud. She always did. When the trader arrived that spring, she stood quietly among the others, wrists bound, eyes lowered. She did not fight. She did not resist. Inside, something settled into place. The first sale mattered more than any that followed. It would determine whether she survived long enough to build what she imagined. The trader, a man named Thomas Redford, examined her like an animal. "She looks sturdy," he said. "Smart." Ashford hesitated. "Obedient," he replied. Hagar hid her smile. Because neither man understood the truth. She was not being sold because she was dangerous. She was being sold because the system had failed to see what danger really looked like. And as the wagon rolled away from Sweetwater for the first time, Hagar watched the road ahead with the same calm patience she would one day bring to an auction block. She was 17 years old, and the long game had begun. Thomas Redford's plantation lay 40 miles west of Sweetwater, where the land dipped low and the air carried the smell of damp leaves and rot. It was smaller than Ashford's holdings, poorer, more desperate. Fences leaned. Barns sagged. Men watched one another with the hard eyes of people who knew there was never enough to go around. Redford was not a gentleman planter. He did not speak of Christian duty or paternal care. He spoke of yield, of profit, of how much labor a body could give before it failed. He bought Hagar because he wanted to prove something. The rumors had reached him before she had. A tall woman, strong, silent, too sharp-eyed, too much trouble. Redford believed trouble could be corrected with pain. He put her in the fields the first morning and watched from horseback as she worked. He noticed how quickly she learned the rhythm, how she matched the pace of the strongest men without being told, how she did not complain when her hands split and bled. "She'll break," he told himself. "They all do." But Redford made a mistake early. He mistook endurance for submission. At Sweetwater, punishment had been rare and calculated. At Redford's plantation, it was constant and careless. Whips fell for spilled water, for slowness, for imagined disrespect. Overseers used pain the way others used punctuation. Hagar absorbed it without reaction. That unsettled them. Pain was supposed to produce sound. Tears. Begging. Hagar gave none of it. At night, she learned the plantation's weaknesses. Redford drank heavily. Cards and dice ruled his evenings. Debt followed him like a shadow. He owed money to traders, to merchants, to men whose patience was thinning. And he was careless with paper. His study was locked. But the lock was old. Hagar opened it the third night. She did not rush. She read by moonlight, careful not to disturb anything. Ledgers, contracts, letters, names repeated, dates circled, and something else. A complete set of Virginia legal codes. She felt something then, something like gratitude, or fate. For weeks she lived two lives. By day, she worked until her shoulders burned and her back stiffened, taking lashes when Redford decided she needed reminding. By night, she became something else entirely. She learned the law. Not the myth of it. Not the speeches. The machinery. She learned how people were defined as property. How ownership was transferred. How freedom, rare as it was, sometimes slipped through cracks no one bothered to seal. She learned about deeds and wills and technical language that could overturn lives with a sentence. And she learned something vital. The system assumed ignorance. Everything rested on that assumption. By the end of her first year, Redford was losing money faster than he admitted. The harvest was poor. His gambling worsened. He began selling off smaller assets to stay afloat. Hagar watched. And then she moved. She did not burn a house. She did not poison livestock. That would have drawn investigation. She chose fire, but controlled. One night, she lit dry leaves in the tobacco barn just enough to blacken beams and ruin a portion of the crop. The fire was discovered quickly. Damage was limited. But fear spread faster than flames. Redford stood in the barn the next morning, staring at the scorched timbers, his hands shaking. Someone whispered Hagar's name. That was enough. Within a week, he decided to sell her. He told himself it was business. That she brought bad luck. That she was not worth the risk. Hagar heard the decision before it reached paper. She did not interfere. The second sale came swiftly. This time, she was purchased by a trader named Marcus Webb, a man whose voice boomed with confidence and whose hands betrayed him. He wore fine coats. He bullied buyers. He barked orders. And he could not read. Hagar knew it the first day. She watched how he avoided documents. How he relied on clerks. How he recognized contracts by the shape of signatures, not words. Illiteracy was his secret. On the second night of the journey south, chained in a coffle beneath cold stars, Hagar worked her wrists free using a trick she had practiced for years. She moved silently. Webb woke to steal at his throat. "I know what you cannot do," she said softly. "And I know what that cost you if spoken aloud." He froze. She did not threaten him with death. That would have been crude. She threatened him with exposure. She gave him a name, a destination, a lie to tell. And Webb agreed. Because power does not always belong to the man holding the whip. Sometimes it belongs to the woman who understands paper. William Garrett would be the next master. And with him, Hagar would learn something new. Cruelty could be intelligent. And intelligence made men far more dangerous. But Hagar was learning too. And every sale was sharpening the blade. William Garrett's plantation sat on high ground in Henrico County, surrounded by fields that looked orderly from a distance and felt suffocating once inside them. Everything about the place was precise. Rows straight. Schedules exact. Punishments timed. Nothing happened by accident. Garrett liked control. He was tall, spare, with pale eyes that missed nothing. He did not shout. He did not drink. He did not lose his temper. Men like that were always the worst. When Marcus Webb delivered Hagar, Garrett was already waiting. "So," he said, walking slowly around her, "you are the one." Hagar kept her eyes lowered. "I have heard stories," Garrett continued. "They say you ruin men, farms, fortunes." He smiled thinly. "We will see." From the beginning, Garrett watched her differently. He tested her with questions meant to catch a clever slave off guard. He left books lying open. He asked her to carry documents, then casually inquired about their contents. Hagar answered wrong every time. On purpose. She pretended not to recognize letters. She mangled numbers. She played confusion so well it bordered on stupidity. Garrett frowned, recalibrated, and tried again. Weeks passed. Then months. Garrett grew irritated. He wanted confirmation of the rumors. Proof that she was special. Proof that breaking her would mean something. So he escalated. He punished others in front of her, watching her face for reaction. Nothing. He assigned her impossible tasks, hoping to see frustration. Nothing. He denied her sleep. She endured. What Garrett did not know, what he would never know, was that Hagar had learned how men like him worked long before she arrived. Cruelty that required an audience fed on reaction. Deny it and the cruelty turned inward. At night, Hagar lay awake in her narrow cabin and counted. Footsteps. Just the exact moment guards changed. She mapped the plantation in her mind the way she once mapped libraries. And slowly, carefully, she began building again. She identified 3 enslaved people who watched rather than spoke. Who listened. Who remembered. She taught them nothing outright. She showed them patterns. Let them draw conclusions. Garrett noticed whispers. He responded with violence. 2 men were beaten nearly to death for suspected plotting. 1 woman disappeared entirely. No explanation given. Hagar did not flinch. Inside she marked the date. Because Garrett had made another mistake. He believed fear erased memory. It sharpened it. By the 2nd year, Garrett's obsession with Hagar hardened into something personal. He wanted her to confess, to literacy, to conspiracy, to being exactly what he feared. When a slave from a neighboring plantation was caught with a book and tortured into naming Hagar, Garrett believed it was finally over. He summoned her to the main house. He laid the accusation before her. The punishment, the consequences, and then he waited. Hagar smiled. That smile ended him. "You are going to sell me," she said calmly. "Tomorrow." Garrett laughed once, short, sharp, then stopped when she continued. She spoke of his debts, of the land he had stolen, of the man he had killed and buried as a runaway, of his wife and the minister. Each word landed precisely. Garrett felt the ground tilt. "How?" he whispered. "It does not matter," Hagar replied. "What matters is choice." For the first time in his life, Garrett understood fear without spectacle, fear without noise. The next morning, Hagar was gone. Garrett never spoke her name again, and something inside him never recovered. Hagar's 4th sale carried her back toward Richmond, toward markets larger and louder, toward places where information flowed like water. She had survived intelligence without conscience. Now she needed something else. Reach. The Richmond slave market would give it to her. And there, among thousands of waiting bodies, she would meet the man who turned her quiet resistance into a living network. What none of them knew yet, what no ledger could record, was that by this point Hagar Ashford was no longer reacting to the system. She was using it, and the center was finally within reach. The Richmond slave market did not sleep. It breathed, slow and heavy, like an animal fed by suffering. The buildings near the river stretched wide and low, brick darkened by smoke and years of human despair. Inside the holding pens, men, women, and children waited in silence broken only by sobs, prayers, and the scrape of chains across stone. Hagar had stood on auction blocks before. But this place was different. This was not a farm clearing or a county square. This was industry. Process. Scale. Here, thousands passed through every year, shipped south to cotton and sugar, east to rice, west to places from which no one wrote back. Families were dismantled with clerical efficiency. Names were replaced with prices. Hagar watched everything. She counted guards, noted shift changes, observed which traders spoke too much, which buyers avoided eye contact. She memorized destinations shouted aloud, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and the men who preferred each one. And she listened. Information moved freely here, disguised as gossip. Traders bragged. Buyers complained. Clerks argued over numbers. In 3 days, Hagar learned more about the slave trade than most enslaved people learned in a lifetime. That was when she noticed Solomon. He sat in the adjacent pen, older, gray, threading his hair, hands scarred not from field labor but from tools. A blacksmith. Skill. Valuable. And still sold. More importantly, he listened the way she did. They spoke carefully at first, shared observations that sounded like complaints but carried meaning beneath them. Routes, names, patterns. When trust settled, Hagar leaned closer. "You can read," she said softly. Solomon's eyes flicked to her face, then away. "A little," he replied. "Enough to be dangerous." "Good," she said. "I need dangerous." That night, while guards dozed and the river carried voices away, Hagar spoke of what she was building. Not everything, just enough. A map, a network, information passed hand to hand, memory to memory. A way to move knowledge faster than chains could move bodies. Solomon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "You are either blessed," he said, "or doomed. Maybe both. What do you need?" "Names," Hagar said. "Routes. Who can be trusted?" For hours, Solomon spoke. Plantations in North Carolina. Men who ferried messages hidden in wagon axles. Women who remembered entire letters after hearing them once. Preachers who listened more than they spoke. By dawn, Solomon was sold south. Hagar never saw him again. But his knowledge traveled with her. She was purchased by Robert Cunningham, a small tobacco farmer in Hanover County. Unremarkable, uncurious, safe. Exactly what she needed. Cunningham worked his slaves hard but watched them little. His farm sat at a crossroads where traders, peddlers, and travelers passed daily. Hagar made herself useful, offering water, carrying loads, listening. She asked innocent questions. "Where are you coming from?" You hear anything new? She remembered everything. Within a year, she had contacts on 20 plantations. Within 2, more than 40. She taught no one to read openly. She taught them patterns, signals, codes that looked like prayer, like work, like fatigue. Messages passed through gestures and pauses. She was building intelligence, and intelligence required movement. So she engineered another sale. By 1843, she let superstition do the work. She predicted storms, corrected numbers again, spoke truth she should not have known. Cunningham grew afraid. He sold her quickly. This time to James Monroe, a trader who moved people between markets like cargo. 6 months and coffles followed, brutal miles, broken bodies, despair. But for Hagar it was education. Every chain was a connection. Every stop a node. By the time Monroe sold her again, Hagar's network spanned 4 states. She was no longer a woman reacting to sale. She was a woman choosing them. And the next plantation would give her what she had been searching for all along. The law, revealed not as theory but as weapon. Frederick Holmes's plantation sat in Louisa County, tucked behind a stand of old oaks and run like an extension of a courthouse rather than a farm. Holmes was not simply a planter. He was a lawyer, trained, methodical, precise. He believed rules were the spine of civilization, and that slavery endured because it was written, stamped, and filed. That belief would undo him. Hagar recognized the place's value the first week. Holmes kept records, real records, court transcripts, deeds, wills, correspondence with judges and clerks across Virginia. His study was not large, but it was dense with paper. Law lived there. Holmes trusted paper more than people. He trusted Hagar because she worked without comment, lifted boxes without complaint, and never looked curious. At night, she became something else. She read. Not quickly, not greedily, carefully, case by case, decision by decision. She learned how judges actually ruled, not how the law pretended to work. She learned how precedent bent when power leaned on it and how sometimes, rarely, it cracked in unexpected ways. That was when she found it. An old case from 1812, almost forgotten, barely cited. A slave named James had been promised freedom in his master's will. Before the master died, James was sold. The new owner claimed the promise no longer applied. The court disagreed. A promise of freedom, once made and witnessed, followed the person, not the sale. Hagar read the ruling 3 times. Then again. The implication settled slowly like a weight. Promises mattered. Words mattered. Paper mattered. If a master could be induced, tricked, pressured, convinced into promising freedom, and if that promise could be recorded, then sale did not erase it. The system had built its own trap. Hagar spent months confirming it. She cross-referenced cases, compared handwriting, studied the witnesses courts accepted and those they rejected. She learned which judges favored technicalities over intent. She learned how to make paper speak louder than whips. But one precedent was not enough. She needed more. She needed patterns, reinforcement. So she stayed. For 2 years, she absorbed everything Holmes owned. He never suspected. Why would he? The idea that an enslaved woman could understand law at that depth did not exist in his mind. When she left his plantation, sold again by design, she carried something no chain could restrain. A blueprint. Her 7th, 8th, and 9th sales followed with precision. Each plantation was chosen for access, not comfort. One sat near a rail depot. Another bordered a county courthouse. Another belonged to a family tied to the state legislature. At each stop, she gathered paper, copied handwriting, learned which seals mattered and which were ceremonial. She practiced forgery until even she could not distinguish her work from the original. By 1850, Hagar was 30 years old. Her body bore the years, scarred, thickened by labor. Her face had hardened into something unreadable. Her network now touched over 200 plantations across 5 states. She was ready. Her 10th sale brought her to Oak Hill in Henrico County. The owner's name tightened something in her chest. Thomas Ashford, son of Charles Ashford. He had inherited Sweetwater and expanded aggressively, 6 plantations, over 800 enslaved people, debts layered beneath ambition. He did not recognize her. Time had done its work. Hagar recognized him immediately. She heard his father's voice in his commands, saw his father's certainty in his posture. And when she looked at Oak Hill's ledgers, she saw chaos. Rapid expansion left paper weak. Records incomplete. Sales overlapping. Ownership claims poorly documented. It was everything she needed. For 2 years she worked quietly, learned his signature, his habits, his shortcuts. She copied documents, altered dates, created contradictions too subtle to raise alarms. She was careful, because destruction required timing. Then, in 1852, everything almost collapsed. Ashford announced he was selling Oak Hill. Liquidation. Panic rippled through the quarters. Hagar understood the danger immediately. If she was sold outside his empire, access ended. Control vanished. She needed leverage. And it came from a place she did not expect. Elizabeth Ashford. Thomas's wife was devout, earnest, troubled. She watched families torn apart and prayed harder instead of questioning aloud. Hagar noticed. She made herself useful in the house. Quoted scripture softly. Spoke of mercy. Seeds planted carefully grow best. When Thomas announced the sale, Elizabeth objected. For weeks she resisted. They compromised. Oak Hill's enslaved people would be redistributed, not sold publicly. Hagar was transferred. Back to Sweetwater. 20 years after watching her mother vanish down that road, she returned. She stood where Ruth had bled, touched the tree she had leaned against. I am back, she whispered. And I am not leaving this unfinished. She did not know it yet, but the final move was close. And the paper was already burning. Sweetwater had not softened with age. The fields were wider, the quarters more crowded, the routines sharper. Charles Ashford was gone, but his discipline lingered in the way men walked and women kept their eyes lowered. Thomas Ashford had turned the plantation into a headquarters. Ledgers thicker, wagons more frequent, clerks everywhere. Power had centralized. So had paper. Hagar moved through it like a shadow. She worked where she was told, fields, barns, storehouses, never lingering long enough to draw notice. But she listened. She counted. She learned which doors were left unlocked after dusk and which rooms were considered too dull to guard. The records room became her map. Thomas Ashford's expansion had outpaced his order. Documents arrived from 6 plantations, deeds, bills of sale, loan agreements, insurance statements, each written by different hands, sealed by different clerks, stored in different chests. Contradictions multiplied quietly. Dates overlapped. Names appeared twice. Signatures varied. A system built on paper hates inconsistency. Hagar loved it. She waited months before touching anything. She watched how clerks handled disputes, how they smoothed errors instead of fixing them, how Thomas trusted summaries over originals, how fatigue replaced scrutiny. Then she began. She altered nothing essential at first. A date shifted by a day. A middle initial added. A witness name misspelled in a way that matched another document's error. Each change alone meant nothing. Together they formed doubt. She practiced restraint, because the trap required credibility. In 1854, Thomas Ashford ordered a partial redistribution of labor to a newly acquired plantation in Chesterfield County. Hagar was among those transferred, her 11th sale, though the word barely applied anymore. Her network moved with her. Messages traveled faster than wagons. Codes held. Distance no longer mattered. By 1856, Thomas made the decision Hagar had been waiting for. He ordered all ownership records consolidated at Sweetwater. Loans were being renegotiated. Insurers demanded proof. The Civil War loomed like a storm no one wanted to name. Thomas wanted certainty. He summoned paper from every corner of his empire. Boxes arrived by wagon. Clerks worked day and night. New shelves were built. A master registry began. And Hagar was assigned to assist. She lifted crates, sorted bundles, retrieved files. She stood beside clerks as they argued over legibility and precedent. She listened to their assumptions. This one's clean. That seal's good enough. Close it. We'll verify later. Later never came. Each night after the clerks left, Hagar worked alone. She replaced documents with prepared copies. She inserted agreements that never existed. She removed originals that would expose contradictions. She aligned handwriting styles to match periods of known disorder. She saved the most dangerous work for last. Manumission. Not declarations shouted aloud. Those were easy to challenge, but promises embedded in routine paperwork. Service agreements. Conditional releases. Notes and margins witnessed by men long dead. She created hundreds. 847 names. Each attached to a promise. Each promise attached to Thomas Ashford's hand. She knew the risk. Forgery could collapse under scrutiny. Experts could disagree. Courts could hesitate. So she added chaos. In November of 1856, a tobacco barn burned on Ashford's second-largest plantation. Records not yet transferred were lost. In December, tools failed inexplicably on another property. Livestock wandered free. Overseers quit. Schedules fractured. In January, a Richmond bank called a loan early, based on a document Thomas could not find. None of it traced back to her, but all of it pressed time. By spring, Thomas was exhausted. His health faltered. His confidence cracked. When the master registry was placed before him on May 15, 1857, he signed. He did not read it closely. 3 days later, James Henderson filed a petition in Henrico County Court. 847 enslaved people claimed freedom, based on Ashford's own records. The court examined the papers. They matched. Handwriting. Seal. Witness. Thomas protested. Claimed conspiracy. Claimed fraud. But the trap was complete. If the registry was false, he was guilty of perjury. If it was true, he had freed them himself. The court ordered review. Months passed. During that time, Hagar waited. She had done her part. What followed no longer belonged to her hands. Only to paper. The courthouse in Henrico County had never seen anything like it. On the morning of May 18, 1857, men crowded the steps before the doors even opened. Lawyers in stiff coats, planters with red faces, clerks clutching bundles of paper. Word had spread quickly. Too quickly. 847 enslaved people were claiming freedom. Not through rebellion. Not through violence. Through documents. Thomas Ashford arrived pale and furious, his confidence leaking with every step. He spoke loudly, insisting this was madness, forgery, an insult to order itself. He demanded arrest. He demanded silence. The judge listened, and then asked for the papers. 4 days, the courtroom became a battlefield of ink. Experts were called. Handwriting compared. Seals examined. Dates argued. Each time the court expected something to fail, it held. The documents matched Ashford's own registry. The signatures were his. The witnesses, dead, yes, but historically valid. What Ashford did not know was that Hagar had chosen those witnesses precisely because they were gone. Men whose handwriting existed in other records. Men whose deaths made contradiction impossible. The law moved slowly, but it moved. And with every passing week, Thomas Ashford weakened. Banks froze credit. Buyers hesitated. Insurance claims stalled. His name, once spoken with respect, now traveled with suspicion. Inside the quarters, hope spread like fire. No one spoke it aloud. Not yet. But people began packing small things. Memorizing routes. Teaching children names they might soon be allowed to keep. Hagar watched quietly. She did not celebrate. She waited. In August of 1857, the court issued its preliminary ruling. The manumission agreements appeared genuine. Pending final determination, the people named were to be released. The gates opened. 847 men, women, and children walked out of bondage. They walked past overseers who could not meet their eyes. Past houses they had built but never owned. Past fields that had stolen their strength. Some cried. Some stood stunned. Some dropped to their knees. Hagar walked with them, but she did not stop. She knew better than to believe the danger had passed. Ashford fought. For 3 years he fought like a man drowning. He hired investigators. Accused clerks. Called in favors. He insisted the entire thing was an elaborate plot. He was right. But plots leave fingerprints. This one left paper. In 1860, the final ruling came down. The agreements were upheld. The freed were free. Thomas Ashford was ruined. His empire collapsed under debt and disgrace. His health failed. He died in October, months before the war arrived to finish what paper had begun. Sweetwater emptied. And Hagar Ashford disappeared. She did not attend celebrations. Did not give speeches. Did not stay. She had never trusted victories that announced themselves. Some say she went north. Others swear she crossed into Canada. A few claim she returned during the war, feeding routes and names to Union men who did not ask questions. No record confirms any of it. That was deliberate. Hagar had spent her life learning how history erased people. She made sure it would not erase her work. The network remained. Codes passed on. Routes refined. The machinery she built outlived her name. By the time the 13th Amendment ended slavery in law, Hagar's system had already freed thousands in practice. But perhaps her greatest act was this. She proved slavery could be broken from inside. Not with muskets, with minds, with patience, with paper. Hagar Ashford left Sweetwater the same way she had entered most places in her life. Quietly. No speech marked her departure. No farewell. On the morning after the court's final ruling, While former overseers argued with clerks and freed families gathered what little they owned, Hagar slipped away before the sun cleared the trees. She carried nothing that could identify her. No papers. No letters. No proof she had ever existed beyond memory. That, too, was intentional. People who broke systems rarely survived admiration. Hagar understood this better than anyone. She had seen what happened to those who stood too visibly at the center of change. They were hunted, studied, destroyed. She chose absence. Within weeks, rumors began. Some said she traveled north using the same routes she had helped others learn. Sleeping in barns, crossing rivers at night, passing codes from hand to hand like breath. Others claimed she settled briefly in Pennsylvania, teaching reading to children who would never know the price of ignorance. A few insisted she returned south during the war. Those stories were whispered most carefully. Men in blue uniforms reportedly arrived at plantations knowing exactly where supply wagons passed, where patrols changed, where records were kept. They never named a source. Hagar never confirmed anything. She never denied it either. What is known, what survived the paper, is this. The 847 freed by the court ruling did not scatter and vanish as slaveholders had predicted. They formed communities, churches, schools. They learned to read openly. They taught their children names that could not be sold. And they remembered. They remembered the woman who had stood tall and silent and watched. They remembered the codes, the pauses, the signs scratched where no one looked. They passed them on, adapting them, evolving them. By the early 1860s, the network Hagar had built folded seamlessly into what white newspapers would later call the Underground Railroad. The language changed. The work did not. By 1865, when slavery ended in law, thousands had already escaped in practice, guided by paths drawn years earlier in one woman's mind. Hagar Ashford never claimed credit. She did not need to. History has a way of recording only what power recognizes. Women like Hagar existed in the margins, in footnotes that were never written, in testimonies dismissed as exaggeration. But memory survives differently. In 1892, a group of elderly men and women gathered in a small cemetery in Henrico County. They were gray-haired then. But many walked with canes carved from wood they had once cut as slaves. They carried a stone. It bore no name. Just 5 words. She remembered. She returned. She freed. Below it, carved carefully, was a small mark, simple, almost meaningless to outsiders. To those who knew, it said everything. The way is open. Pass in safety. No one could say for certain that Hagar lay beneath that soil. Most believed she did not. But the stone was never about burial. It was about acknowledgement. About refusal to let erasure win. Years later, when historians searched records, they found contradictions. Missing documents. Court filings that should not have existed but did. They argued over whether the case was exaggeration, whether clerks had erred, whether Thomas Ashford had been incompetent rather than deceived. They missed the point. Systems do not collapse from error alone. They collapse when someone learns how to use their own rules against them. Hagar Ashford did not destroy slavery by force. She did not spill blood. She did not burn plantations to the ground. She understood something far more dangerous. Slavery was not held together by iron. It was held together by paper. And paper can be written, forged, molded, lost, burned. The last words attributed to Hagar Ashford survive only through oral history, passed from one freed family to another, spoken in kitchens and schoolrooms long before anyone thought to write them down. They tried to make me an animal, she said. They denied me words so I would forget I was human. They sold me like livestock and thought that was enough. But the mind cannot be chained. Knowledge does not bruise. Memory does not bleed. She was sold 12 times. 12 times they tried to reduce her to an object. Each time she learned more. Each time she sharpened the blade they never saw coming. In the end, she did not need to destroy them. She let their own signatures do it for her. Today, visitors still walk through that small cemetery. They pause at the unnamed stone without knowing why. They feel something there, a weight, a presence. They do not know her story, but they feel its truth. Because Hagar Ashford did what slavery feared most. She learned. She waited. And she won. When the gates of Sweetwater finally stood open, when the dust settled and the ledgers closed, there was a strange silence that followed. Not peace. Silence. The kind that comes after something ancient collapses and the world has not yet learned how to speak without it. Hagar Ashford did not remain to witness it. She understood something most people never do. Systems do not forgive the ones who expose them. Men who had lost fortunes, pride, and power would look for a face to blame. a body to punish, a name to erase. So she became what she had always mastered: untraceable. She left Virginia on foot at night, guided by routes she herself had drawn years earlier. Barns that open without questions. Doors marked with signs invisible to outsiders. People who did not ask her name and did not need it. For a time, she moved north with others. Families clutching children, men still flinching at raised voices, women who carried their freedom the way one carries something fragile and unreal. Some remembered her as a presence more than a person. A tall woman who never hurried. A woman who listened more than she spoke. A woman who never stayed long. Eventually, she vanished completely. No census recorded her. No death certificate claimed her. No grave bears her name. And that was deliberate. Hagar Ashford had spent her life learning how history worked, how it preserved power and erased resistance. She knew that if her name survived too clearly, her work might not. So she erased herself instead. But her work remained. The 847 people freed through the Ashford case did not scatter into anonymity as slaveholders had predicted. They built lives deliberately, almost defiantly. Churches rose where cabins once stood. Schools appeared where reading had once meant death. Children learned letters openly, loudly, without fear. And they remembered. They remembered the codes passed through gestures. The pauses that meant danger. The symbols scratched where no one thought to look. Those methods did not disappear. They evolved. By the early years of the Civil War, Union officers in Virginia and North Carolina began noticing something strange. Enslaved people arrived at their lines already knowing which roads were safe, which patrols slept, which bridges were watched. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to. Hagar's network, never centralized, never written down, slipped seamlessly into the larger resistance history would later call the Underground Railroad. It did not need leaders. It did not need banners. It needed memory. By the time slavery was finally abolished in law, thousands had already escaped it in practice, guided by paths mapped long before cannons ever fired. Years later, historians argued. They debated whether the Ashford manumissions were clerical error, incompetence, or coincidence. They argued about forged documents and missing records, about courts that had ruled strangely and judges who had looked away at the right moment. They searched for a mastermind. They found none. Because history struggles to recognize resistance that does not look like rebellion. Hagar Ashford did not burn plantations. She did not lead an army. She did not shout. She understood something far more dangerous. Slavery was not held together by chains alone. It was held together by paper. And paper obeys the hand that knows how to write. That was her legacy. She proved that intelligence denied becomes intelligence weaponized. That patience can outlast brutality. That systems built on rules can be destroyed by someone who understands them better than their creators. In 1892, long after the war had ended, a group of elderly men and women gathered in a small cemetery in Henrico County. Many walked with canes. Some had scars that never faded. All of them had once been counted as property. They placed a stone. No name. No dates. Just 5 words. She remembered. She returned. She freed. Beneath it, a small symbol, one few would notice. It meant, the way is open. Pass in safety. Visitors still pause there sometimes without knowing why. They feel something they cannot explain. A presence. A weight. A truth pressing up through the soil. They do not know her story, but they feel its echo. Because Hagar Ashford did what slavery feared most. She learned. She waited. And she won. What do you think about Hagar Ashford's story? Was her greatest weapon intelligence or patience? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more dark historical stories like this, stories buried by time but too powerful to be forgotten, subscribe to Chronicles of Shadows, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who believes these voices deserve to be heard. These lives were meant to be erased. Remembering them is an act of resistance. See you in the next story.